When it comes to the film adaptations of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, there is no shortage of people willing to lambast these movies and let out a stream of vitriolic rants and criticism on just how supposedly bad they are. But are these films really worth all the hate? Like most things in life, the truth lies somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. There are aspects that these films did well, while they fell short in others. That may seem like an indecisive response, but the takeaway is that these movies are nowhere near the steaming trash heap that most people would claim that they are. For starters, let's discuss what it means to be an adaptation. While there will inevitably be alterations from the source material when an adaptation is made, especially to a different medium, those in charge should adhere as closely to the original as possible, else you can end up with something that will share the same name, but be a completely different work. Note that this does not determine its quality, as you can make a good film that is a poor adaptation, or vice versa. This, however, begs the question of why one wouldn't simply make their own original work. If one has no desire to adhere to the work one is adapting, then it shouldn't share the name. The Hobbit films do a remarkable job at sticking to the major beats of the novel, but that novel wasn't even close to Tolkien's best. The Lord of the Rings, The Children of Húrin, The Silmarillion, and others all far surpass The Hobbit, and this leads to the first problem, the comparison to The Lord of the Rings. The original trilogy that came out a decade earlier are based off of some of Tolkien's best work. This already gave those films an advantage as compared to The Hobbit, as many will cling to the subjective reasoning of, it's not like The Lord of the Rings. Well, neither was the book. It was written as though it were a story being told orally to a listener, and many times featured lines such as, I tell you, and others, such as out-of-universe comparisons to the real world. It was also aimed at a much younger audience and was written well before The Lord of the Rings was fleshed out, leading to many incongruous elements.
Many of these flaws were mitigated in the films. Take the trolls, for instance. In the book, these trolls possessed a talking purse, which is how the company was caught, after Bilbo attempted to steal it and it cried out. In the adaptation, Bilbo was grabbed accidentally by the trolls, which is far more in line with the universe than a screaming purse. As stated before, one should attempt to adhere as closely as possible to the source material, but if there is an opportunity to shore up gaps or inconsistencies in said source material, then a change is warranted, so long as it does not deviate in a way that would lead to the work becoming something entirely different. It is an adaptation, after all, not a completely original work.
And this brings me to the first point of discussion, the characters. More will be said about them as they become relevant, but a brief synopsis will serve to address the point. For starters, Martin Freeman absolutely nails the role of Bilbo. He begins the films as what a hobbit should be on paper, someone who strictly follows a schedule, adheres to public niceties, and above all doesn't rock the boat in society. But through one spur-of-the-moment decision, he then partakes in a journey across a large portion of Middle-earth, and finds out what it means to truly have friends and take part in something that matters. Despite being weak and cowardly in the beginning, Bilbo grows into someone who is willing to break from those norms that he stuck to so fervently, such as when he stands up to Thorin in the final act, giving the Arkenstone that his friend covets to his enemy in an attempt to make him see reason. While he'll never be a great warrior due to his inferior stature and strength from being a hobbit, Bilbo shows just as much, if not more, courage than many of the fighters seen in these films. Ian McKellen once again reprises the role of Gandalf, and his performances in these movies are just as stunning as in The Lord of the Rings. Here he plays a Gandalf who is less experienced and sure of himself, and it helps to show the audience how he came to be the wizard we see in the original films. Now, in lore he has accomplished many feats before this point, but the Gandalf from The Hobbit was underdeveloped and was used more as a plot device than a character. The focus on Gandalf growing into a leader gives us the details on how he was able to lead the forces of the Free Peoples against Sauron later. Richard Armitage gives Thorin far more depth than his original counterpart possessed, and more will be said about him and the rest of the dwarves later, but for the first time we get to see how a dwarven leader behaves. We've seen leaders of men in Aragorn and Theoden, elven leaders in Galadriel and Elrond, and even a small amount of orcish leadership in Gothmog, but until now we only had Gimli for reference in the films, and while he was certainly a skilled warrior and steadfast friend, he was not a leader. Thorin shows both virtues and vices of his people, such as how he always aids the innocent and makes sure that those under his command are safe before he is, but also displays his pride and stubbornness. Azog is a new addition, though not one without reason. The films needed a proper antagonist, as the novels lacked one, and the meandering tale of the book would have made for a clumsy movie if it had lacked someone for Thorin and the dwarves to strive against. He appears in Tolkien's work in the appendices as a prominent orc that began the war of the dwarves and orcs, but he was dead by the time of The Hobbit. The orc in the book was his son Bolg, who does appear in the films, though the relationship of orc father and son is only mentioned once by Gandalf. Bolg only appeared at the end of the novel, however, and was only mentioned, not seen. In this version of events, Azog survived the Battle of Esnulbazar, but had his left arm dismembered by Thorin. Having previously sworn to end the bloodline of Durin, Azog's vendetta is increased, and he now stalks Thorin throughout their quest. Not only that, but he is directly under the command of Sauron, who has taken up the title of the Necromancer, and dwells within the fortress of Dol Guldur. Sauron uses Azog as a commander of his armies in the region, which aids Azog's quest to kill Thorin. This also acts as a catalyst for the beginning of Bilbo's heroism when he rescues Thorin from being executed by one of his underlings. Thorin's death now has more impact to it as well, as he and his rival die at the hands of each other, rather than occurring off-screen as with the book. So while the performance of the actors and actresses was mostly top-notch, and most of the changes and additions served the plot for the better, what about the films themselves? In this video I'll only be covering An Unexpected Journey, as the Desolation of Smaug and the Battle of Five Armies will be receiving their own videos discussing their triumphs and shortcomings. Now, on to the first film. We open with Bilbo beginning the Red Book, which was mentioned in the Fellowship of the Ring as the book that Bilbo has been writing, and it's the book that Frodo gives to Sam to finish at the end of The Return of the King. His recounting lays out the exposition of the events leading up to the start of An Unexpected Journey, where we see that the kingdom of Erebor and the city of Dale were overrun by Smaug the dragon, and that Thorin's grandfather Thror possessed the Arkenstone, a priceless artifact that the dwarves acknowledge as belonging to the rightful ruler of their people. It's shown that Thror did not treat his neighboring nations with respect, however, and as a result none take pity on the now homeless dwarves. I do have to question the shot of the Elven King Thranduil appearing with an army as Erebor is attacked by Smaug, though. There's no way he could have arrived so quickly unless he left Mirkwood in advance of Smaug's attack, and why would he bring his forces to Erebor just to turn away? This may have been done for artistic value, being a more visual representation of the Elven King's response to the plight of the dwarves, but if so, it was not communicated clearly. It's a flaw to be sure, but not one strong enough to break the movie. We see that as Thorin and his people drifted from place to place, taking work where they could find it, he became a bitter individual, and his anger clouds many of his actions, setting him up for how he will treat Bilbo for most of the first film. Even in this flashback, you can see that he is not without virtue, though, as he tries to the utmost of his ability to hold off Smaug, even though he fails, while Thror is only concerned with his wealth and the Arkenstone, even shoving aside his people as he flees. Already we can get a sense of the difference between Thorin and his grandfather. Thorin's first action upon Smaug's attack is to marshal the defense. He immediately goes into action to defend his people and his home, and is fearless in doing so. Thror, on the other hand, flees from danger, running to retrieve the Arkenstone before he abandons his subjects. He's even more traumatized by the loss of the Arkenstone than he is the loss of his realm. As the flashback concludes, we get a tie-in to the Fellowship of the Ring, with present-day Bilbo speaking to Frodo about the party that will be held that night, and Frodo then departs where he will meet with Gandalf. As was stated before, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were always related, but due to the nature of their development, the former doesn't mesh well in many instances with Tolkien's later works. In order to assist in tying these films together, Bag End is just as it appears in the original films, and the roles of Bilbo and Frodo are reprised by Ian Holm and Elijah Wood respectively, and even the musical scores from The Lord of the Rings. All of this helps to ease the viewer into these prequels, which could have been jarring if it hadn't been handled as well as it was. We then cut to 60 years earlier, where a much younger Bilbo meets Gandalf, and the pair's dynamic is drastically different from what we see in Fellowship. Bilbo doesn't even recognize Gandalf, though the wizard does mention Bilbo's mother by name, indicating that he knew her, and his dialogue implies that she would not approve of Bilbo being a homebody who is a stickler for rules and punctuality. Even though Bilbo refuses to have any part of an adventure, Gandalf carves a dwarven rune into his door to mark his home as the location for the dwarves to meet that night. Now, why would Gandalf select Bilbo, who makes it very clear that he wants nothing to do with an adventure? For starters, he knew Bilbo's mother, and hints that she wouldn't have hesitated to participate, and he believes that Bilbo has potential within him. Secondly, as it is stated later, dragons have incredibly keen senses, and the smell of a dwarf creeping around and looking for the Arkenstone would surely enrage him. But he's never smelled a hobbit before, and so he may go unnoticed by the dragon, not to mention that hobbits can move quite silently when they choose to. Then there's the fact that the goal of the quest was not to kill Smaug, but to obtain the Arkenstone, which would give Thorin authority over the dwarven people. After that's done, then they could focus on killing the dragon. Finally, Erebor sits in a strategic location, and Gandalf, as is made clear later, is aware that Sauron's forces are moving. If they took Erebor, or allied with Smaug, the consequences would be devastating. Can you imagine Smaug taking part in the Battle of Pelennor Fields? The forces of the West wouldn't have stood a chance. It's only by luck that Smaug is slain in the third film, but that will be discussed when we get there. Later, as Bilbo is about to sit down and eat dinner, his doorbell rings several times, each instance indicating the arrival of more dwarves, and they proceed to messily consume the entirety of his larder. With Bilbo's rising ire, Gandalf becomes more amused, and even though the dwarves sing a song directly from the book on how they will destroy and dismantle Bilbo's finery, they do a remarkable job of cleaning up after themselves, indicating that they are not out to simply plunder his home. Thorin is the last to arrive, and his demeanor is in stark contrast with that of the other dwarves. He is outright insulting to Bilbo in his own home before he moves off to eat his share. All of the other dwarves were fairly kind to Bilbo, being indifferent towards him at the worst. This relates to Thorin's backstory, which was discussed earlier. Bilbo is not someone who can help him retake his home, or so he thinks, and is not someone who could understand the hard times his people have fallen upon. Thorin clearly sees him as soft and weak, thus not worthy of his time. Keep in mind this is the start of his character arc. His opinion will change later. Thorin then delivers the news that the other dwarven kingdoms will not provide aid, as the quest is theirs alone. This prompts Bilbo to ask what quest he is referring to. His question is answered by Thorin explaining to his comrades that Smaug hasn't been active in the past 60 years, and that others may try their hand at taking Erebor if the dwarves do not do so first. The dwarves then begin to argue over their chances, but here we can see just how much they respect Thorin, as they immediately cease bickering at a word from him, and they set aside their doubts at his speech. Gandalf then reveals that he has a key given to him by Thorin's father for safekeeping, which he then passes on to Thorin. He describes that there is a secret passage into Erebor that they must find, and that they will need a burglar to retrieve the Arkenstone, which will prompt the other dwarven kingdoms to aid them. It's then revealed to Bilbo that Gandalf wants him to be this burglar. Bilbo initially objects vehemently to this, and the dwarves express doubt at his ability, but Gandalf is fervent in his belief that Bilbo has what it takes, and that while Smaug knows the smell of dwarf, Hobbit is unknown to him, which will be the advantage they need to have someone sneak inside. While Bilbo reads out his contract, Thorin makes it clear to Gandalf that he won't be held responsible for Bilbo's well-being. At the notion of being incinerated by a dragon, Bilbo faints, doing nothing to engender faith in him from the dwarves.
Afterwards, he and Gandalf have a discussion about how Bilbo always wanted to adventure as a child, but is now content to simply exist. For clarification, all people have roughly 3 states that they can exist in: surviving, existing, and living. Survival means that you have to scrounge for basic necessities, and any day your life could come to an end. Clearly, Bilbo doesn't lack for food, water, or shelter, so this is definitely not where he is positioned. On the other end of the spectrum, you have truly living. This is when you're doing something you're passionate about, something that fulfills you. You find your life has meaning. Again, Bilbo doesn't fit into this category, as his days are structured by routine and simply doing what society expects. He doesn't have anything that makes him feel truly alive. The third category sits in between these two. It's existing. Here you don't lack necessities, but you don't have anything that makes you feel satisfied with your life. You feel like you're missing something, that you want more. Having a job that you hate but pays the bills would fit this criterion. This is Gandalf's way of offering Bilbo an opportunity to do something that matters, and to find his reason for living. At this point, Bilbo doesn't know it, but he's missing something in his life. This quest will let him experience the world and get context for what the Shire and his life in it really are. Most other hobbits are content to simply exist, carrying on their day-to-day humdrum lives, but Bilbo finds this lacking, whether he wants to admit it or not, or indeed if he is even aware he feels this way. But ultimately Bilbo refuses Gandalf's offer, being unable to cope with the concept of the quest. Balin notices this and laments that without a burglar to retrieve the Arkenstone, their quest cannot continue. Thorin denounces this, and plans to continue anyway despite Balin's objections. He declares that his father and grandfather passed the key to the hidden door down to him, and that Erebor is the rightful home of their people, along with the wealth found there.
He states that he would take the 12 dwarves that answered his call over an army from their neighboring land of the Iron Hills, as they have shown him loyalty. This is where we see two defining traits of Thorin. The first is that he prizes camaraderie, and this will be demonstrated numerous times over the course of the films. The second is his fixation on the material goods of Erebor, a trait that will be his undoing, and will challenge the former characteristic. After hearing a song by the dwarves lamenting the loss of their home, Bilbo awakens to find a surprisingly clean home, indicating that the dwarves did not have any ill will towards him, as no trace of their carousing of the previous night can be seen. Bilbo notices the unsigned contract he had left on the table, and Martin Freeman's acting shows us that something is stirring inside Bilbo. On a spur-of-the-moment decision, quite unusual and something heavily frowned upon by hobbits, Bilbo signs the contract and makes a mad dash across the Shire to meet the dwarves, cutting across fields and generally displeasing the other more mundane hobbits. While he couldn't deal with the scope of such a quest the previous night, waking up and realizing that he has the options to either continue existing or to strike out and do something truly worthwhile tips the scales. Some people are content with a simple life, but not Bilbo. A point to note is that the dwarves took wagers amongst themselves on if Bilbo would reconsider, with most of them having decided that he wouldn't. Even Gandalf partook, though it's made apparent by the bag of coins tossed to him that he had betted that Bilbo would show up. After several days, indicated by the panoramic scenery shots that these films and their predecessors are known for, the company have made camp for the night. Bilbo is alarmed by the unusual noises in the distance, and Fili and Kili amuse themselves by telling him that these noises are made by orcs, who will likely raid their camp to murder them. Again, we get characterization for the dwarves that we didn't have in the book. Fili and Kili are mischievous to an extent. They find it funny to get Bilbo worked up over the thought of orcs being nearby. It's not the most profound of character moments, but it is objectively more than we received in the novel. Thorin is thoroughly unamused by this, and rebukes them harshly as he storms off. Balin then explains to the confused pair that Thorin has bad memories of orcs that caused him to react so violently. Thorin, along with his father and grandfather, had led a large force in an attempt to retake Moria after the fall of Erebor, but it was now held by a vast number of orcs led by Azog the Defiler. Azog had sworn to end the line of Durin, and to that end he killed Thror in battle, displaying his severed head as a trophy. The dwarves began to rout after the death of their king, but Thorin proved himself when he seemingly slew Azog, severing the orc's left arm. Though Azog and the orcs were driven back, the dwarves lost too many of their own to push further. But it was not a complete loss. Thorin had won the hearts of his people, cementing himself as their leader, at least to those of Erebor. His father was missing after the battle, however, and was never seen again. While this is expanded upon in the extended edition, the theatrical cut omits Thrain's fate. Bilbo asks what became of Azog, to which Thorin replies that he bled out from the injury. Unbeknownst to the dwarves, however, they are being watched from across their cliffside camp by a group of orcs, who give word that a message is to be sent to their master. Already this sets up something that the novel lacked that would become a problem for a film. The book was written as a children's story, and as such many elements of modern storytelling are absent. One of these was a proper antagonist. The dwarves faced enemies and others that hindered them, sure, but there was not a true force that was opposing them. The book revolved mostly around a series of obstacles that would arise, be dealt with, and generally not be seen again. Even Smaug never confronted them directly. While this worked in the context of the book, in films such as these it would be anticlimactic and lacking focus. Azog not only accomplishes this, but he helps to tie these films into The Lord of the Rings by dealing with Sauron. The Necromancer is mentioned only once in passing in the novel, and never revealed to be Sauron. Now, however, we have an active threat by both the antagonist of this series and the antagonist of the next. But Dual-Wielder, I hear you say. Sauron never confronted the Fellowship directly either. And you're correct, he didn't. But he was actively making moves against the forces of the Free People. He had armies assaulting Gondor, he coerced Saruman to make war with Rohan, and his Nazgul were constantly searching for the ring. Smaug does none of this, hence why Azog was needed. As the dwarves continue their journey, their conversation about the rain transitions into the mention and introduction of Radagast, another wizard like Gandalf. His role was omitted in the film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, but he is present in these movies. In line with Gandalf's description of the character, Radagast cares for the plants and wildlife of Middle-earth, and he is clearly worried about many dead forest animals and diseased plants and fungi that he has found.
He is shown to be able to communicate with birds and other animals, as two birds respond to his call, and he is in great distress over an injured hedgehog that he is familiar with enough to call him by his name, Sebastian. He's shown attempting numerous remedies to heal Sebastian, but none of them work, leading to him to realize that this is no unnatural ailment that's threatening the forest. Shadowy silhouettes move around his house, and he bars the door, hastily using magic to draw out whatever was ailing the hedgehog while creatures attempt to break into his home. As he succeeds, the monsters vanish, and Radagast sees that they were in fact monstrously large spiders. He asks a bird where they came from, and then demands that the avian shows him. This is the start of the setup of the story arc that took place during the events of the book, but was only revealed in the appendices of The Return of the King. This will lead to the explanation of where Gandalf went when he leaves the dwarves in Mirkwood. As the scene cuts back to Thorin's company, Gandalf inspects their campsite, and upon examining the dilapidated ruins of a house, he mutters to himself that a farmer and his family used to live here. He then remarks to Thorin that they should move on, seeking refuge in Rivendell, but Thorin shuts this idea down, wanting nothing to do with elves. He is still clearly bitter that his people received no aid from the Mirkwood elves, and as such, all elves receive a blanket judgment from him. Gandalf then storms off, unwilling to deal with Thorin for the time being. That night, Gandalf's fears are proven to have been well-founded, as two of the ponies have disappeared, taken by trolls, confirming Gandalf's fears of what happened to the family that lived on the farm that used to be here. Fili and Kili prompt Bilbo to recover the horses, and while he is still confused at the notion, they vanish. Bilbo tries to steal a blade from one of the trolls while they are distracted by their argument, but is accidentally snatched up by one of them. At that point, the rest of the dwarves arrive, indicating that Fili and Kili had not callously sent Bilbo to almost certain death. As the dwarves engage the trolls in a rather well-choreographed fight, with all of them supporting each other as a team, Bilbo manages to free the ponies. This, along with his attempt to steal the troll's blade earlier, are the first instances of bravery from Bilbo, along with his ability to think more than the dwarves do. The dwarves are skilled fighters, but most of them do not think things through beyond the moment, usually jumping to fighting as their first course of action. Bilbo, despite being unarmed and vastly smaller and weaker than the trolls, still made an effort to free the ponies, and uses the distraction of the dwarves showing up to do so. Unfortunately for him, the sight of the fleeing equine is enough to get the trolls' attention again, though, and they grab Bilbo, threatening to kill him if the dwarves don't surrender. Thorin is the first to put down his weapon, indicating that despite his distaste for Bilbo, he isn't cruel enough to let him die in such a way. The trolls then subdue the dwarves and begin preparing them to be eaten, debating various methods of preparation, but one insists that they don't have enough time for anything extravagant, as daylight is not far off and it will turn them to stone. Bilbo notices this and begins to distract them by instructing them on how to prepare the dwarves, buying the company time. Thorin eventually realizes what Bilbo is trying to do, and signals to the other dwarves to cease their objection to Bilbo's plans, instead fervently agreeing. Again, we see that the dwarves do not excel at thinking ahead, but they are loyal to Thorin, and when he tells them to agree with Bilbo, they will do so, even if they don't understand why. As the trolls finally realize what Bilbo's been up to, Gandalf returns and splits the rock that they had been huddled behind in half, and the rising sun turns the three to stone. As Thorin discusses what transpired with Gandalf, he remarks that Bilbo was not a skilled enough burglar to retrieve the ponies. Gandalf counters this by pointing out that only Bilbo had thought to use the troll's stupidity to play for time for the sun to rise. It's unclear if this instills any respect for Bilbo and Thorin, but he makes no further comment on the issue. The company then discover the cave that the trolls had been using to hide from the sun and to store their treasure, in which the swords Orcrist and Glamdring are found. Thorin takes the former, while Gandalf takes the latter, which he will continue to use for the entirety of these films and The Lord of the Rings. An odd detail is that Gandalf's sword doesn't match the aesthetics of the other elven weapons in the series, despite sharing an origin with Sting and Orcrist. It isn't impossible that it would be different, but it's just something I always thought was odd. Thorin initially attempts to refuse the weapon because it was forged by elves, until Gandalf points out that swords of its quality are absurdly rare. We get a bit of characterization from some of the other dwarves as well, with Gloin, Nori, and Bofur burying some of the treasure so that they can potentially claim it later, with Dwalin looking on in exasperation. Gandalf then discovers the blade that Bilbo will go on to name Sting. Upon giving the weapon to Bilbo, he imparts the advice that true courage is about knowing not when to take a life, but when to spare one, advice that will become incredibly important later. The group is then surprised by Radagast, and an interesting point to note is that Bilbo checks to see if his sword is glowing,
as Gandalf had just informed him that it would glow blue if orcs were close by. Instead, it is Radagast who has been looking for Gandalf. He reveals that he investigated the previously abandoned fortress of Dol-Guldur by pursuing the spiders, and found that it is occupied by the necromancer. We see that while Radagast is not an exceptional warrior, he is not incapable of defending himself, and while he is airheaded, he isn't stupid. He even retrieved the Morgul blade dropped by the Witch King to back up his story. After seeing the dagger, Gandalf agrees with him, and though they do not yet know who or what the necromancer is, Gandalf deems that it is important enough to bring to the White Council later. Additionally, we get to see how two wizards interact who are on roughly equal footing to each other, as Saruman outranks the other four and maintains an air of superiority because of it, while Gandalf and Radagast speak as friends. Before Gandalf can decide what to do with the information, however, the group are ambushed by wargs, which have thankfully been corrected from their Lord of the Rings counterparts. One of the small criticisms I lay on the original trilogy was that the wargs, which are supposed to be intelligent, malevolent wolves, were depicted as slavering hyenas. While it wasn't a large fault given their involvement, it did irk me. Peter Jackson and the rest of the production team are to be commended for doing better on them this time around. What is less commendable, however, is what follows. Radagast volunteers to draw off the rest of the wargs and the orcs accompanying them so that the dwarves Bilbo and Gandalf can escape, but his plan is not clear. He does draw the attention of all of their pursuers for quite some time, but he never leads them very far away. In good faith, this can be seen as his escape being cut off, which does happen several times, but at others it is unclear as to why he doesn't put more distance between himself and the dwarves. This means that the group needs to have a sequence where they attempt to remain out of sight from the ever-shifting chase until they are eventually found. Fortunately for them, however, Gandalf knows the location of a tunnel that will allow them to evade the orcs. We get another character moment from Thorin, who is the last to retreat, making sure that all of his subordinates are able to escape, showing that he both cares for his followers and can demonstrate leadership in a crisis. The orcs are forced to withdraw, though, as elves from Rivendell arrive and begin assaulting their war party. One of the orcs is shot through the neck and falls down the tunnel, revealing to the dwarves that elves are in the area by the shape of the arrowhead. As they follow the tunnel, they arrive at an entrance to Rivendell. Thorin is outraged, declaring that this was Gandalf's plan all along, which the wizard doesn't deny, though he does denounce that the elves are their enemies. Gandalf insists that they have questions about the map and key that can only be answered by Elrond, and thus he will do the talking, citing that Thorin lacks tact in conversation. As the dwarves arrive, so does Elrond, and an interesting point to note is that because the dwarves believe that they may be attacked by the elves, Beaufort takes the time to pull Bilbo into the middle of their formation while they close ranks, indicating that they do care about the Hobbit, at least to some extent. It's easy to miss, and the movie doesn't call any attention to it, but small details like this demonstrate that care was put into these films. Balin is also shown to be on friendly terms with Bilbo, as while Elrond examines and details the swords that they recovered from the trolls, he and Bilbo discuss whether the sword that will later be named Sting has seen battle. Balin casually remarks that it's more of a letter opener than a sword, but he doesn't put any ill will behind the statement. Despite Elrond's greetings and rather gracious offer to allow the dwarves to stay, Thorin still distrusts him.
Welcome, Thorin, son of Thrain.
I do not believe we have met.
You have your grandfather's bearing. I knew Thror when he ruled under the mountain.
Indeed. He made no mention of you.
That night, Thorin once again refuses to show Elrond the map, claiming that it and its secrets are entrusted to him, and is adamant that any elf should not see it, though he visibly struggles with allowing any information of his attempt to reclaim his birthright slip with the need to have the map's information discovered. Eventually, Gandalf stresses that Elrond is one of only a few people who will be able to decipher it, and Thorin relents. Elrond discovers that there is more text upon the map that can only be read beneath the moon, while it matches the lunar phase that was present while they were written. It's here that they discover that on the last light of Durin's day, that light will shine upon the keyhole to which their key corresponds. As Balin explains, they have to be in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, or they won't be able to open the door, and thus will have no way of sneaking past Smaug. Elrond, though he doesn't make any move to stop the dwarves on this quest, tells them that it is unwise, implying that Smaug has remained largely inert since he took the mountain, and the dwarves' meddling has the chance of rousing the dragon's wrath. This establishes that Thorin is correct to be wary of whom they let know of their quest. Elrond will not stop them, but others might.
The scene changes, and we see that the orc who was in charge of the group that had attacked the dwarves is reporting to none other than Azog, who has survived his injuries. The one-armed orc expresses dissatisfaction at the failure of his subordinate and promptly feeds him to his wargs. Here we see what orc leadership looks like without the influence of Sauron. It's more of a neat pick than anything else, but it's the first interaction we see in these films of how an orc rules through fear. Previously, the only orc leader we had seen was Gothmog, but he had the authority of Sauron and the Nazgul behind him, and was largely a commander, rather than a warrior. Azog is both. He lacks some of the tactical thinking of Gothmog, but he is much more physically capable. An orc leader in this context keeps control of his forces through fear of pain or death, and this is one of the contexts in which that is acceptable. Many forms of media depict villains killing their subordinates frequently, and in those scenarios one would question why anyone would follow them. The orcs don't have the luxury of leaving or mutinying, as Azog would simply kill the ringleaders and beat the others into submission. A nitpick of this scene, though, would be that Azog is on Weathertop, where Frodo will later be stabbed by the Witch King in Fellowship. This location is still somewhat far from Rivendell, and I have to question when this scene takes place in relation to the one before it, as this couldn't be on the same night, as the orc who is executed couldn't have made it all the way from Rivendell to here in one night. In continuation with Radagast's discovery and Elrond's warnings is a meeting of the White Council, where Saruman attempts to shut Gandalf down on all of his ideas and points. Everything Gandalf brings up, Saruman dismisses as unimportant or that Gandalf is exaggerating. He even dismisses Radagast entirely, despite them both being Astari. We get more characterization for Saruman in this scene, as he was almost entirely viewed as an enemy in the original films. He is clearly prideful, and does everything in his power to make sure that everyone knows that he is the head of their council. Though never explicitly stated in the films, this is the early stages of Saruman's betrayal in The Lord of the Rings, as he knew full well that the necromancer was indeed Sauron, and that he was attempting to study his movements to locate the One Ring for himself. His attempts to stonewall Gandalf are to keep him, Galadriel, and Elrond from making a move that would put Sauron off the trail. It follows, when presented with the evidence that the Nazgul are abroad again for the first time in centuries, Saruman tries to shut Gandalf down, insisting that events are lesser than what Gandalf makes of them, and that there is no reason for the dwarves to continue their quest. Though unbeknownst to him, Gandalf either knew that the dwarves would leave once they had the information they needed, or told them to leave while he distracted Elrond. Which of these options is true, we are never made aware, but regardless, Gandalf has ensured that his plans will continue, with or without the White Council's approval. As the dwarves depart, Gandalf and Galadriel share a one-on-one conversation, and it's made clear that even though Saruman is the more powerful wizard and is their leader, she places more stock in Gandalf, informing him that there is more to the necromancer threat than they realize, and that he won't move yet, at least not until whatever plan he's hatching is ready. As the dwarves are crossing the Misty Mountains, now without Gandalf escorting them, they are caught up in a battle between stone giants, creatures that were only mentioned briefly in the novel. Their inclusion is a nice homage that could easily have been omitted, and we are once again given more characterization for Thorin. He risks his own life to save Bilbo from falling to his death, and it very nearly costs him his life. He lambasts Bilbo afterwards, though, indicating that while he will give his all to save an innocent, he will not be glad doing it. While what Thorin says here could be taken as frustration at Bilbo, and him feeling that the Hobbit is dead weight in their group, his reaction is quite strong for such a thing, and we get the subtext that there is more to his anger than just this event. Also of note, Beaufort again is the first one to notice that Bilbo was missing, and begins searching for him, showing far more personality than his book counterpart ever did. We then have a short scene showing that Azog has not given up the hunt, as his wargs have picked up the dwarves' scent since they left Rivendell, and he deduces correctly that they have taken the mountain pass where he will head them off. It's a brief scene, but it does help to establish that although Azog has been shown to be violent and uses fear to intimidate his followers, he is still capable of critical thought, more than most orcs we've seen.
Hands off! That shiny shirt, that's mine!
Let's go into the Great Eye, along with everything else.
I don't take orders from stinking Morgul rats!
You touch it, and I'll stick this blade in your gut.
As the dwarves sleep, Bilbo is at an impasse. After what Thorin said about him having no place among the dwarves, his belief in himself vanishes, and he attempts to sneak off back to Rivendell. Bofur was assigned watch by Thorin and notices him trying to leave, however. Bofur tries to convince Bilbo that he's one of them, and that he's just homesick, and that he understands. Bilbo counters this point by saying that the dwarves are used to traveling and not belonging anywhere. Clearly this was not the message he intended to have, as he immediately regrets his choice of words when Bofur's expression changes. Bofur doesn't have any hard feelings, however, understanding what Bilbo meant. With remorse, he wishes Bilbo good luck. Unbeknownst to both of them, Thorin is awake, and was privy to the entire exchange. Now, this never occurred in the book, but it does give us a chance, for better or worse, for Bilbo to confront what he's doing. When he set out, it was a drop-of-the-hat decision, and he had no way of truly knowing what it would entail other than sneaking past Smaug. Now, though, he's had his life threatened more than once, and Thorin clearly does not trust him. He now has two options. He can turn around and make his way back home, or he can stick it out with the dwarves. This adds a bit of depth to Bilbo, as he now questions himself and what he's doing, instead of trudging along after the dwarves and hoping for the best.
Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't.
Thorin also seems to realize that he may have been too hard on Bilbo. After all, Thorin has been trained as a warrior and heir to the throne for his whole life, and then fell upon hard times that hardened him still further after Smaug's attack. Bilbo has had none of that. From the look on his face, Thorin begins to grasp that he can't hold Bilbo to the same standard that he holds himself. Gandalf was correct about Sting glowing blue when orcs are nearby, though, as Bofur notices the blade glowing from inside its scabbard. The warning comes too late, however, as even with Thorin alerting the others, the floor gives way beneath them, and they are deposited into the clutches of the goblins who have taken over this region. Bilbo manages to use his small size to his advantage and slip underneath the goblins' feet as they march the dwarves away, but Nori witnesses this as he is hauled away. In an act of courage that Bilbo had previously denied possessing, he tries to sneak after the goblins, looking for an opportunity to help the dwarves. His act of heroism is cut short, though, as a goblin straggler notices him and they engage in a brief tussle, resulting in both parties falling off of the walkway and into the chasm below. The dwarves are then presented to the Great Goblin, who demands to know what they were doing in his territory. None of them are willing to speak, and so the Great Goblin orders his people to torture them, starting with Ori, the youngest. This prompts Thorin to speak up, as he won't stand for those following him to come to harm, and he is promptly mocked by the Great Goblin, who brings up that even though he should be king under the mountain, he has no kingdom to rule. What's more, the Great Goblin reveals to Thorin that Azog is not in fact dead. Thorin tries to deny it, but the Great Goblin is only amused by this. He orders one of his underlings to send word to Azog that he has found his prize. Returning to Bilbo, we find that the Hobbit is mostly uninjured from the fall, thanks to landing on a pile of mushrooms. The goblin that attacked him was less fortunate, having landed on the rock. Gollum makes his first appearance, complete with the glowing eyes that were mentioned in the book, and finishes off the goblin, dragging it away to be eaten. As he beats it to death with a rock, however, Bilbo notices a ring slip from Gollum's clutches. After Gollum drags the goblin away, Bilbo retrieves the ring, and the track from The Lord of the Rings returns, Roots and Beginnings. It's a superb moment that helps serve to connect this work with The Lord of the Rings, which was rather sporadic in the novel. What follows is an almost one-to-one translation of the scene from the book of Bilbo's encounter with Gollum, complete with almost all of the riddles, and Bilbo revealing his name and homeland to Gollum, which will later be tortured out of him by Sauron. The performances of Martin Freeman and Andy Serkis are top-notch, bringing Bilbo and Gollum to life, portraying this pivotal interaction of Middle-earth's history excellently. Bilbo tricks Gollum into a game of riddles, wagering that if he wins, Gollum will show him the way out, while if Gollum wins, he will be eaten. He plays into Gollum's rare chance for social interaction, and combines it with a small amount of flattery, which will be his tactic in his encounter with Smaug in the following film. On a macabre note, it's actually the Smeagol personality of Gollum that suggests that Bilbo be eaten if he loses, not Gollum. As Gollum begins to lose patience, Bilbo struggles to come up with a riddle. Gollum picks up a rock, the scene implying that he will kill Bilbo regardless of the outcome of their game. In his panic, Bilbo touches his pocket, and having forgotten he found the ring earlier, asks, "What have I got in my pocket?" to himself. Gollum, perceiving this to be a riddle, becomes infuriated and fails to guess what Bilbo has. Even though Gollum lost, and by rights should show Bilbo how to escape, he instead tries to use the ring to become invisible and attack Bilbo, only to find that he no longer possesses it. Gollum then deduces that the ring is what he had in his pocket. He lunges at Bilbo, who flees for his life. As the goblins prepare to torture the dwarves, one of them examines the weapons that the dwarves have been carrying. Upon unsheathing Thorin's sword, all of them react in panic, and the great goblin recognizes it as the Goblin Cleaver. In their fear, they begin to attack the dwarves, their previous plans to torture them and give them to Azog being forgotten. They are saved by the return of Gandalf, however, who unleashes a burst of magic that disorients and stuns the goblins. The goblins' fear is only increased now, as they also recognize Gandalf's sword, both weapons having killed innumerable members of their race. The dwarves manage to take their weapons back, and Gandalf leads them out of the caves, slaying the great goblin in the process. These scenes show that the dwarves are not defenseless, and are in fact capable warriors, something that the movie has not had a chance to showcase until now. The trolls had Bilbo hostage, rendering them unable to fight without them killing him, and the orcs near Rivendell were numerous and had wargs with them. Here, however, they are able to fight to their full potential, showing the audience that they are not solely relying on Gandalf. Gandalf's slaying of the Great Goblin also bears a small resemblance to his later fight with the Balrog in terms of visual style, and could be considered a small homage to the scene, and like the work that this is portraying, the tone and stakes of the quest are lesser here than in The Lord of the Rings, though the quality is not. Bilbo has now gotten lost in the caves, and Gollum can be heard screaming at him in the dark. Bilbo squeezes through a narrow crack in the caves as Gollum catches up to him, and in a callback to Fellowship, the ring flies from his grip and lands on his finger, just as it will do with Frodo. The ring will be established to be sentient in The Lord of the Rings, and while this would seem like chance, it is actually attempting to help Bilbo escape, as it will never be found by Sauron if it remains in Gollum's cave, just like how it wants to be found by the Nazgul when Frodo has it.
The ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found.
This leads to Bilbo discovering the ring's ability to render its wearer invisible, as he notices that Gollum can no longer see him. Another observation is that the Wraith World, which is what Bilbo and Frodo experience whenever they put on the ring, is much calmer in these films than in The Lord of the Rings. This is likely because Sauron is not as active, and does not yet know where to begin searching for the ring. This is a small note, but one that shows attention to detail, and is to be lauded. Gollum deduces that Bilbo knew the way out, and heads there to cut him off, unaware that he has actually led Bilbo to the very exit he was attempting to keep him from. Bilbo notices Gandalf and the dwarves flee past where he is hiding, but Gollum is between him and the exit. Bilbo now has the perfect chance to kill Gollum, being invisible and armed with Sting, but he can't bring himself to do it. Just as Frodo takes pity on Gollum in The Two Towers, so too does Bilbo take pity on how wretched Gollum is. Instead, he jumps over Gollum, delivering a kick to his face as he passes. Gollum can't bring himself to face the outside world at this point, and remains in the caves, screaming in lament at the loss of the ring. This plays into how Bilbo possessed the ring for 60 years and was not corrupted by it as quickly as Gollum. Smeagol's first act when he encountered the ring was murder, while Bilbo's first act was mercy. While Bilbo would eventually become like Gollum if he had kept the ring long enough, the corruption is slower if the person holding it was less inclined towards evil. As the dwarves regroup downhill of their escape, Gandalf does a head count to make sure that all of them are accounted for. When he discovers that Bilbo isn't with them, however, he begins to panic. You can clearly tell by the tone of his voice that Gandalf is terrified that he was the cause of Bilbo's death. After all, if he hadn't convinced him to go on this journey, he wouldn't be missing. Nori mentions that he saw Bilbo slip away when they were captured, and Thorin rants that Bilbo saw a chance to escape and took it. Now we get the revelation as to why Thorin has treated Bilbo so poorly. He says that Bilbo has only thought about his home and its comfort since he left with them, and Bilbo will no doubt be making his way back to them, abandoning the dwarves in their quest. Not only is Thorin angry that Bilbo has no loyalty to them, at least as far as he can tell, but he's also envious. Bilbo has a home and all the comforts and security that go with it, but the dwarves have had theirs stolen from them. He wishes that he had what Bilbo has. Bilbo has a look of sadness before he reveals himself, as Thorin's words hurt in a way that he's not accustomed to, but he also understands now why Thorin was so dismissive of him before. He takes off the ring and steps out from behind a tree, informing them that he hasn't run off. Thorin looks first surprised that Bilbo is with them, but then he seems to be disappointed in himself. We only linger on the shot for a moment, but it's clear that Thorin feels guilty over what he just said. He just harshly admonished Bilbo, and yet even after that the Hobbit is still willing to travel with them. Gandalf is also thoroughly relieved now that Bilbo is safe. Fili and Kili are astonished, and they ask Bilbo how he got away from the goblins.
to which the dwarves and Gandalf all seem interested in hearing as well. Bilbo stammers for a moment, almost revealing the ring, as he puts a hand in his pocket where he stashed it, and Gandalf almost suspects something. Before the issue can be pressed, though, he changes the subject, stating that it doesn't matter how Bilbo escaped, only that he did. We don't get context here as to why Gandalf intervened, but if he did suspect that Bilbo somehow acquired one of the lost rings of power, it would be unwise to let the dwarves know about it, given the trouble it would cause. If this isn't the case, then he would likely want to spare Bilbo the trauma of reliving what he had just went through, as Bilbo is not a traveler or warrior accustomed to what they had just experienced, unlike the dwarves. Thorin, however, demands to know why Bilbo came back. The expression on his face is completely different now than what he has had throughout the entirety of the film when he's spoken to Bilbo. Up until now, he's only regarded him with indifference or scorn. Now he looks at him with a measure of respect. And now Bilbo says the most impactful thing he can to Thorin. He states that he's not a great warrior like any of them, and that he does miss his home, because that's where he belongs. He came back because the dwarves don't have what he does, and even though he's just a hobbit, not a powerful wizard or a veteran warrior, he will help them take back their home if he can. This affects not only Thorin, but all the other dwarves as well. They all regard him somberly, and it's clear that even though none of them had been as abrasive to him as Thorin, they had all doubted him and considered him dead weight. To hear someone you had so completely disregarded say that they are willing to help you must hit hard, and it shows on all of their faces. Their moment is to be cut short, however, by the arrival of Azog and his forces. As they flee, Bilbo actually manages to kill a warg, though it's completely by accident. The beast charges him, and he holds out his sword in self-defense, leading to the warg skewering itself. Though this is Bilbo's first kill, it's not his most impactful one. The company find themselves cornered at the edge of a cliff and climb into the trees to be out of reach of the wargs. Thankfully, none of the orcs have bows or crossbows on them. It's a bit of an oversight, but orcs aren't known for their forethought, even the cunning ones like Azog. Gandalf finds a moth in his tree and begins to speak to it. It flies away, and its purpose will become clear later, though for those that have seen The Lord of the Rings, this is clear foreshadowing. It is now that Thorin first sees Azog again, after many years. He is in both disbelief and fear at the sight of his enemy, but to his credit, he doesn't let that sway him, even after Azog taunts him, mentioning how he killed his grandfather. The wargs begin to uproot the trees on Azog's orders, and soon only one is left standing, with all of the dwarves, Gandalf, and Bilbo clinging to its branches. Gandalf lights several pine cones on fire that he and the dwarves hurl at their assailants, and the dry ground around them goes up like kindling, buying them some time. The wargs flee from the fire, but the tree that they have taken refuge in begins to fall, leaving most of the dwarves hanging on for their lives as they are now leaning over the precipice of the cliff. Thorin, once again showing both his courage and sense of loyalty to his comrades, charges Azog. It's a foolish thing to do, but his options are limited at this point. Either he stays where he is and Azog's orcs either slaughter them all or wait for them to fall to their deaths, or he attacks Azog, drawing his attention and giving those under him time to try and recover. Like the king he is, Thorin chooses to defend his people. Thorin's at a tremendous disadvantage, however, as he has only his sword and a tree limb as a shield, while Azog has a mace and a massive warg. The beast tramples Thorin, and before he can recover, Azog strikes him with his mace. The other dwarves and Gandalf are unable to assist, as it is all they can do to hang on to the tree. Only Bilbo is able to climb back onto steady footing in time. As Azog has satisfied himself by beating Thorin, he orders one of his underlings to bring him the dwarf's head. Now is when Bilbo achieves his most impactful kill. As the orc is about to bring its blade down on Thorin's neck, he tackles it, taking it by surprise and killing it. This is the first life that Bilbo consciously takes, and he has done it to save a life. Thorin sees all of this before he loses consciousness, and the shock and alarm are plain to see on his face. Now Bilbo is confronted by Azog himself, along with the rest of the orc's forces, but even here he doesn't back down. Despite having no combat training, or any idea how to properly wield a sword, Bilbo is willing to stand his ground against certain death to protect Thorin. Just like how Sam stuck with Frodo in the trilogy, so too will Bilbo not give up on someone he's given his word to help. Bilbo was successful in giving some of the other dwarves time to recover, though, as a few of their company now charge the wargs. Even Bilbo attacks, though he is far less successful than his companions. The moth that Gandalf had spoken to now returns, just as Dori and Ori lose their grip and fall.
The music swells, and it's the same score that has always accompanied the Eagles in the trilogy. Many of them arrive, and in ones and twos they manage to snatch up the dwarves, Gandalf, and Bilbo, and carry them to safety. Azog is livid at the escape of Thorin, but he and his forces have no way of combating the Eagles, and so they retreat. As the sun rises, the Eagles set the company down on a rock outcropping and depart. Many argue that the Eagles should have taken them all the way to the Lonely Mountain, but a counter to that would be that such an endeavor would be seen by all around. The Eagles aren't exactly difficult to spot in the sky, and if elves and humans in the area could notice them, then it's just as likely that Smaug could as well. The senses of dragons are legendary, as Smaug will demonstrate himself, and the commotion of a dozen eagles landing on his doorstep would surely attract his attention, and there's no guarantee that the dwarves would be accepted by any of the peoples nearby. Gandalf uses magic to heal Thorin somewhat, and the dwarf awakens. His first words on awakening are demanding to know where Bilbo is. In a superbly acted scene, Thorin shouts at Bilbo that he could have been killed, and that he claimed that he was a burden and had no place among the dwarves. But in a touching moment, Thorin declares,
I have never been so wrong in all my life. I'm sorry I doubted you.
From now on, even with the events that transpire in the third film, Thorin now regards Bilbo as his friend. He even apologizes, swallowing his pride and admitting that he was wrong. We get a closing sequence of the dwarves being able to see the Lonely Mountain from their vantage point, and a thrush flies past them, heading in its direction. To close the film, an ominous shot of Smaug's nostril and then his eye emerge from beneath a mountain of gold, and the screen cuts to black. So, how does this movie stack up against the many criticisms laid against it? Now, I can't possibly have heard all of the arguments against this film, but the most common of them tend to be subjective, so I will address those first. Many have criticized the films of being overly reliant on CGI, but these claims are vague at best. What defines too much? Pixar films are composed entirely of CGI, and nobody says that they use it too much. Is it that it is used in a live-action film? If that's the case, then this argument is without substance and would factor into one's enjoyment of the movie rather than it being considered good or bad. Is it the quality of the CGI? Again, that is a subjective claim. All one can do is state that they consider the quality to be low, and all one has to do to counter that is to say that it isn't. Both are equally empty points. Personally, I never found it to be distracting or out of place, but that is my subjective take, and this entire argument has never held water. Others have claimed that the sequences are too over the top. This is also a vague point, as many battles in The Lord of the Rings involve sequences that could be considered over the top, and yet claims against them are almost non-existent. And even if this is the case, what would be the qualifier of them being bad? Again, this argument is without substance. Still more people have complained about it being split into 3 films. I will cover both of the following movies in their own videos, and address the flaws and successes of them in their turn, but this criticism has always been odd to me. When a film adaptation is made from a book or other material, things will need to be cut for various reasons. Many times it is for time constraints, but also certain elements are more difficult to portray in a film than in other media, or for various other reasons. Making additional films from a piece of media can resolve many of these, and have fewer elements left on the cutting room floor. I don't recall many complaints that the final Harry Potter film was divided into 2, and it was riddled with far more flaws than these are, some with the source material and some not. Making multiple films out of a single work also benefits everyone, as if the films are good, the audience receives more good films to watch, while if they are bad, then no one is forcing anyone to sit through subsequent installments. I myself refused to see The Rise of Skywalker after The Last Jedi made it so abundantly clear that the executives running the Star Wars franchise were only interested in pushing their politics and destroying the world and characters that had been previously established. Finally, this claim doesn't lay any actual point against these films, but simply gripes that there are more films. Again, this has no substance to it. The final and most common criticism I've heard is that the films don't focus on Bilbo. This is laughably untrue, as Bilbo has quite a large amount of screen time, and a complete character arc over the course of 3 films, receiving more development to his character and motivations than the book had time for. More valid strikes against an unexpected journey would be about specific incidents, rather than the entirety of the film series,
As mentioned before, it would have been impossible for Thranduil to bring his forces to Erebor so quickly in the prologue, and why would he suddenly turn them away? An army takes time to assemble, and still more to march to a location. The elves of Mirkwood arrive at the Lonely Mountain as the dwarven people are still fleeing from it, meaning that the only way they could have arrived at that time is if they had left before Smaug attacked. And why, after assembling his forces, with their arms and armor, supplies, and everything else that goes with a marching army, would Thranduil simply turn away? They arrived kitted out for war, but then they decide to turn around and go home. For what purpose? Another point would be that the dwarves are able to easily leave Rivendell despite Saruman and possibly Elrond not agreeing to their quest. The White Council holds great authority, and they want to prevent Thorin from stirring up Smaug when the dragon is content to sleep beneath the Lonely Mountain, but nobody set a watch on them to keep them from leaving while the council discussed their quest and if they should let it proceed. This may have been planned out by Gandalf, but if so, it was never made clear to the audience. We are also not given an explanation as to how Gandalf found the dwarves after they were taken by the goblins. In the book, Gandalf had been with them and had escaped capture. In the film, however, he wasn't with them at the time, leading to the audience to wonder how he knew where they were. Also, Thorin should have been far more injured from a mace colliding with his face. That should have been a lethal strike, and one only needs to look at medieval warfare to see how deadly being struck by someone on horseback, or in this case wargback, is. Now this leads me to what the films did well. One major change for the better was Thorin and the dwarves. In the book, the dwarves were little more than set dressing, having very few lines and given almost nothing to do on their own. Those of you who have read the book tell me, what did Fili and Kili actually do in the novel? If you answered nothing and die at the end, you'd be correct. To varying degrees, the dwarves of Thorin's company all have something unique about them in the films, which is objectively more than the vapid emptiness of their original counterparts. Balin is the eldest and the best at diplomacy. Bofur is the friendliest towards Bilbo. Ori is young and naive. Fili and Kili are rambunctious. They aren't the deepest of character traits, but it's far more than what we were given in the source material. But nowhere is this change more beneficial than with Thorin himself. In the book, he played an incredibly minor role, occasionally chiming in whenever the company encountered another party, such as Beorn, Thranduil, or the Great Goblin, but despite the quest being to retake his home and reinstate his kingship, he barely did anything more than complain. While he is more fleshed out in Tolkien's other works and appendices, it's remarkable how absent he is from the narrative. In stark contrast, the films flesh out his character remarkably well, even if it is slightly different from his novel counterpart. He is established to have witnessed the fall of his kingdom, and has been left embittered by the lack of hospitality he and his people received by their allies, and how far he fell from heir to the throne, to scraping for work wherever he could find it. He's become fixated on regaining his home and power, and has no respect for those that could hinder him, as exemplified by his early interactions with Bilbo. He's cold and insulting towards the Hobbit, seeing him as nothing more than a weakling, but as their quest progresses, he learns that there is more to people than their status or martial prowess. This film starts that journey, and by the end, he has begun to form a friendship with Bilbo. Bilbo is also more developed than he was in the book, and he now has a chance of turning back, but he doesn't, even though he was about to. He develops a personal stake in their quest, rather than being along for the ride and bailing the dwarves out of trouble whenever Gandalf isn't around. We also now have far more connection between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings than we did in the novels, as events have been slightly altered to adjust them to better fit with Tolkien's other works, at least as far as their cinematic adaptations are concerned. The novel had the quest largely exist in a vacuum, but with the addition of Azog, the White Council, and the Necromancer being more than something mentioned in one line, the quest is now one factor in the whole of Middle-earth. In summary, this film does have its flaws, but it also has great successes. I will dissect the desolation of Smaug and the Battle of Five Armies in their own videos, but An Unexpected Journey is far from bad. It has some missteps, but it is still a good movie overall. In terms of objectivity, I'd give this film a 6 out of 10. It has some flaws, but nothing that would shatter it. There are valid criticisms of the first movie in this trilogy, but unfortunately the vast majority of people seem to only take issue with the subjective issues. Being the first of a trilogy, there are setups that are paid off both in this film and its successors. If we're speaking of my subjective opinion, I would give this movie an 8 out of 10, and would definitely recommend it to anyone who's interested. Fans of Tolkien's work will have much to enjoy, both with material from the novel and the inclusion of elements such as Radagast and the White Council. This film also does a fantastic job of capturing the different tone The Hobbit had when compared with The Lord of the Rings, and it's a joy to watch.
I'd like to thank those of you who have stuck around this long for watching this video, and may you all have a weapon in each hand.